did you develop EMDR from this beginning, and how did you bring it into the world?
Initially, doing a lot of presentations, about hundreds of presentations to different psychology groups, the American Psychological Association, every organization I could find, to do presentations to show the research that I had done. And people started giving me their cards to say when I was ready to teach it that they wanted to learn. And during that period of time also developing standards of practice of what would work to teach it well. I was teaching individual therapists at that time and getting feedback from them of the type of effects that they were getting. And then when those people came and learned it, many of them felt that it had a strong potential and they wanted to make it known. And they went back to their own local communities and organized to sponsor workshops there. So I gave many workshops during those first years, many trainings, in order to let it be known as widely as we could.
And many of us therapists were so happy with the results we were seeing for our clients that almost from there's this dedication to help spread EMDR. Yes.
Well, you see, that's the beauty of certain types of clinicians, because I met many during those first years. And some that would come and say, as you just did, I see the potential and I want other people to have it. I will do what I can to make sure it's widespread.
Yes.
But then there were other clinicians who came and said, I see the potential and I don't want anyone else in my community to do it. I want to be the one to do it. And it was those that saw it as an advantage for themselves, really, not for what it could do for others. The beauty of what's happened over all of these years is that clinicians such as you, who really from their heart want to see people healed, that these organizations now are in Europe, in Latin America, in the United States, are dedicated to that and being able to bring it out worldwide. That's the beauty of it being able to touch hearts such as yours.
I think you have changed the lives of many therapists and also of millions of clients all over the world. How does that make you feel when you realize that?
And it is the same as it was at the beginning, that it's wonderful in terms of what it can do, and there's also the pain of how much more there is to do. Of certain doors that are still closed because of misunderstanding, of ignorance, of criticism based on old information or old misunderstandings. And so, for instance, the fact that EMDR is able to eliminate phantom limb pain, and there are millions of people suffering from it, from war, from accidents, from landmines, from diabetes, from so many different areas. And the amount of suffering that these people are going through in their lifetime, which could be eliminated within 12 sessions. There's a good chance that it would be eliminated. And yet these people are still suffering. This is still very painful for me. So it's always that, again, that two-sided of the coin, the joy at what it can do and the pain at what it's not being allowed to do.
As I sit here remembering the 27 years that I have known and worked with Francine Shapiro, I'm first reminded that in a week it will be the first anniversary of her death. I can't remember doing anything relative to EMDR, including how I practice it in my office, that didn't somehow involve either an email or a telephone call from Francine. As I sit here, I can't at the same time imagine speaking about Francine and my relationship with her for the past 27 years without at least once mentioning Robbie Dunton. Although Francine was the face, the voice, the soul of EMDR, Robbie was clearly its heart, ever beating quietly and making sure that the machine of the EMDR movement was always in tune and working. Francine fought fiercely for EMDR her entire life. She discovered and created EMD in the 80s, and she did this while working on her doctorate in psychology. Historically, Francine and her co-workers already had EMD developed by 1987. Most of us heard about it in 1989 from her two published papers. I remember reading the EMD protocol for the first time in 1989. I was just incredulous. It seemed so crazy, but something prevented me from throwing that paper out. In 1990, in the midst of a very difficult case, I taught myself EMD and tried it for the first time. My practice, like many of yours, was forever changed. In 1993, I read that EMD became EMDR. After 3 years of practicing EMD and the exhilarating experience of its speed and its efficacy, I knew at this point that it was time to meet Francine Shapiro and to be formally trained in EMDR by her. I did my formal Part 1 in EMDR in June of 1993 and Part 2 in November of 1993. I remember through that training that people were just clamoring to speak to her. They would line up. So when I went up to her to speak to her for the first time, I wanted to get her attention, to separate myself from all these people who wanted to speak to her. And I remember during the training, she spoke often of being upset by people who had taught themselves EMD or EMDR rather than being formally trained. So when I introduced myself for the first time, of course, what did I say to Francine? I told her that I had been taught myself, and I taught myself EMD in 1990. You can imagine I definitely had her attention at this point. We spoke often during the trainings and at the end of Part 2. I remember at the end of all the trainings, she said to me, maybe after a few years of practicing EMDR, you might want to apply to join the faculty of the EMDR Institute. And in 1995, I did exactly that, and I applied and was accepted. When I remember the most was how Francine drove us to develop EMDR, in addition to all the experiences that we had with her. But what stands out the most is this drive that she basically had and she instilled in all of us. Basically, if you had a skill that was applicable to EMDR's onward development, you would end up having a conversation with Francine. Francine cracked the whip. Researchers were ordered to produce studies, case studies, empirical studies for people who could, full randomized control studies. If you weren't a researcher, Francine ordered you to write clinical papers. When she first read the draft of my first paper, she said to me, "So you like neuroscience, huh? Get this paper published." When she heard that the paper was accepted for publication, she basically said to me, "Congratulations. So when do you begin the next one?" This went on for years. She wanted more papers. She wanted book chapters. She wanted books. I was told to begin lecturing to bring this information to the medical community because of my neuroscience interest. Everyone on the staff of the Institute basically had these conversations with Francine. Francine was always at the center of everything, driving everything, research, neuroscience papers, clinical papers. You couldn't argue with Francine. Those of us who were on the EMDR board of directors in the 2000s, we received calls from Francine. We need a journal. Get going. She wasn't asking any of us to work any harder than she did. Francine worked throughout her illnesses right to the end. She was EMDR's mother. We were EMDR's uncles and aunts. I will miss her forever.